Hi everyone, welcome to the SOTH podcast, ASR's newest initiative where we talk about substance use disorders within the context of the Punjabi community.
Through inviting mental health experts, researchers, community members, and those with lived experiences, we discuss everything from the history of addiction to the lived realities of Punjabi families alongside providing relevant resources.
We are your hosts. I'm Ravia. I'm a community organizer and researcher from Edmonton.
I'm Manvinder, a social work PhD student from Winnipeg.
I'm Harleen, and I'm a medical student and anthropologist from Indiana.
I'm Harpreet. I'm a clinical researcher and an epidemiologist from Toronto. Thanks for joining us, and let's start the conversation.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our fourth episode with Asra, our SOTH podcast. I am Harleen, one of your hosts.
And I'm Manvinder, the other host for today.
We're excited to have Taimour on with us. He's a part of Taraki and talks a lot about and works within men's mental health, and we'll let him take it from here.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me on. So, my name is Taimour. The original pronunciation, or Taimour, which is anglicized way. You can call me whatever. Doesn't necessarily bother me as much. And yes, so I am the project lead at Taraki, and I've been there almost 5 years, leading the men's paid sport program, which is currently funded by Movember since 2021. And I'm not someone from a mental health background or an educational background. I'm actually someone who started attending the spaces back in 2019. In my 20s, I felt a bit lonely. Well, a bit lonely is an understatement. I felt quite lonely and disconnected from what it means to be Punjabi or South Asian and things like that. And so I started attending Taraki's men's paid sport spaces, and the rest we'll get into it in the next hour, but that's a bit about me.
Yeah, thank you for giving us a little bit of background. It's really cool that you were able to go from kind of interacting with these spaces as someone that was going through their own journey and then transitioning into leading them and directing them. So, how was that sort of like journey shaped, and what did that look like for you?
So in November 2019, I started attending the spaces at Turkey, which were held in central London. And yeah, it was a period of my 20s where I felt disconnected from my own mental well-being, from being South Asian, whatever that means, or Punjabi. And really, I just went because I was lonely and I wanted to make some friends, especially brown friends, to be honest, because like I said, I felt disconnected. And so I would attend, and I started attending so much, the facilitators would call me part of the furniture. And of course, then lockdown happened about a year or 18 months into the spaces. And also I was transitioning in life. So at the time I worked in marketing and I was moving countries. So I moved from London to Lisbon, which is where I am now. And I remember by that time I'd accumulated a lot of experiences in being around facilitators, peer support, and also looking back, I think I had a good heart, and I think I really developed a relationship with Shirinjeet because I'll always say this: he was the first person in my life who believed in me, and he saw things in me which I didn't even see myself. So as I'm transitioning to Lisbon, I've quit my marketing job, which pays relatively well, and I've basically taken a jump with my ex-partner at the time. And so I don't know what life looks like, but you're in it, you're in it. And he comes to me and says, "Oh, I have a bit of work for you." And I thought he wanted to make, he was going to ask me to make some designs on Canva or something. And he was like, "I want you to lead the men's paid sport work that is being funded by Movember now to test and scale our Char in the City model, which is effectively paid sport spaces that are held monthly where Punjabi men come and just sit down and have a chat." And I thought he was crazy. Didn't necessarily feel like I was the person for it because I have no mental health background or educational background. Either way, we really, yeah, we dived in, we built a curriculum, we tested that curriculum, we tested the curriculum again, we scaled it to the point where we are now. And, we've delivered that curriculum, not just the curriculum itself, but the spaces. So effectively how it works is we built a 10-session curriculum on how to become a peer support facilitator, but also how to look after your mental well-being from the lens of being Punjabi and South Asian. And so we've been delivering that for about 4.5 years now. And it's been beautiful. I never thought I would be in this position in life. And and yeah, it's been quite a journey.
I'm curious about the part where you shared that you've made this curriculum accessible to like Punjabi people, to South Asians. Like, what does that specifically look like? Or like, what were some considerations that were given?
Of course. So we built a 10-session curriculum on how to become a peer support facilitator for Punjabi men specifically. But it's adaptable. If effectively the curriculum is built so that you can hopefully be able to facilitate spaces or safer spaces for folks from different marginalized communities. And the way we did that is we basically built the curriculum, me and Shiranjit, who is the founder of Taraki, and then we put it through, like, I guess, vet checking. So we had people from different sectors, from climate justice to people in mental health education, to people a bit more mainstream who might just be consultants, to incredible women that we know in our circle who would critically analyze the curriculum. And so we went through a whole process of developing it and then refining it based on their feedback. And yeah, so initially it was a 12 session program, which is a 12-month commitment. Recently we've cut it down to 10 sessions just based on user feedback. And it's a good curriculum. It's hard for me to say that in the sense not to come across arrogant, but having delivered it enough, it has some meaning. And the way it has meaning is that I think it gets to the heart of the problem. Not completely. I don't think anything ever could on an individualized level, but really hopes to understand Punjabi and South Asian men and how they think, how they feel, how they navigate well-being, gender dynamics, active like listening, caregiving. What does that look like for Punjabi and South Asian men? So hopefully it just touches upon those conversations in a way that is gentle but honest.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing sort of the background of what you do. So from what I understand, you do like deliver this curriculum across like various parts of the Punjab diaspora. How does that look in different contexts? What is that like what are the things that you've noticed that are similar, are different in like different contexts?
So it's really interesting. We've delivered this program in Birmingham, in the UK, Leicester, in the UK, London, Leeds, and Wolverhampton. And then we expanded it to Canada, so Surrey, BC. And we've also actually now delivered it in Melbourne, Australia, to South Asian men, so going beyond the Punjabi communities. No one Punjabi person is similar. And I'm talking even on the UK context, right? A Punjabi person from the south of England is like worlds apart to a Punjabi person up in Scotland. So what we've learned through the process is that there is no one singular homogenous Punjabi experience. And we've really tried to honor that by just giving them the tools that we feel are relevant and necessary to explore mental well-being and peer support. But it's a really interesting question. I don't necessarily have a simple, straightforward answer. I have more anecdotes because, yeah, there is a presumption that we have similar experiences, and we do in specific areas. But for the most part, we're actually all very unique and different. So it's also been learning curve for us at Therapy. So, just an overview of the curriculum itself. You've got three modules. The first is personal motivation. The second is like active skill building. So, active and empathetic listening. We also do things like what does a safe space mean? Really, we get down to the basics or fundamentals of everything. And then the third module is just, it's in a sense like practical delivery, but in a safe space. So, you're not necessarily doing it out in the world, you're doing it with people that you feel safe and trusted. And so that's a bit of an overview of the curriculum itself.
So when you mentioned that you have these sort of anecdotes as you're like exploring caregiving and gender dynamics, mental well-being. Like I understand that you're giving people the tools to have these conversations. What kind of topics and themes come up a lot while you're talking to people, delivering this like peer support model to them? And then what comes up for them a lot that they come back to you with as like, this is kind of what I want to work through with my community?
So a really big thing that comes up is loneliness. And I feel like, especially for men, it can take a lot to say that you're lonely, but a really big theme that keeps up coming up, whether we're delivering in the UK or Surrey or in Australia, is that sense of loneliness. The thing that comes up quite often is addiction. So whether it's alcohol or substance addiction, which is that's also quite prevalent. Another thing that's come up quite recently, and this is more working in Surrey, BC, is that effectively the divide between those who are settled Punjabi communities, second or third generation, and those who have recently migrated, and those kinds of tensions that you're seeing as a result of a heightened xenophobia that spread across the world based on migration status. So there's so many nuances that come up, but fundamentally, what the men come to the spaces for, because the best way to deliver peer support is by experiencing peer support, right? And the themes that come up is always like loneliness, and effectively what loneliness does. How does it play out? It can often lead to addiction, substance or alcohol, and then also that sense of, I guess, rejection that a lot of men can feel from their communities, whether it's based on settled status, so those who have recently migrated, language. If English isn't your first language, it can be quite challenging, and things like class. So there's never necessarily a simple cut answer. Again, it's always quite nuanced, and we really try to understand that we're working with the men.
Those are like very interesting things that you've been able to take away, and I'd love to delve into each of them. But I'd love to sort of start with how, because we've talked to a lot of people sort of around substance use disorders, alcohol use disorders within South Asian communities, Punjabi communities. How does that sort of show up in this space, and how does that interact with loneliness and this like language class divide that you're seeing?
So the way it tends to come up in our work quite regularly is a lot of the men come to these spaces from a place of shame. They don't necessarily want to admit that they have a substance or an alcohol addiction, but there really isn't a safe space to go to have those conversations within the communities as well. And that's not to put the blame on the communities, because I feel like when it comes to addictions, even someone like me who works in peer support, I'm not a specialist. If you come to me around an addiction issue, I'm going to signpost you to the relevant person. But I feel like with addiction, which is a big theme in our work, there really, and not to sound like too much of a project manager, but there needs to be a sense of streamlining. Because currently what's happening is that quite a few people have addictions. They don't know where to go to. But fundamentally, what's happening is that they go to a place, get rejected, they come back, feel lonely. They go to another place, they get rejected, they feel even lonelier. They know they can't speak to their families about it because there is so much shame attached to it. So I feel like they intersect so much because, and that's why I feel like when you asked me that question, I feel like loneliness, addiction, and a sense of rejection is quite common because they intersect. You feel lonely, you feel sad, or you feel like you have an addiction, you reach out to someone from the communities, they don't know how to support you because fundamentally, I don't want to put it on the person because they shouldn't be able to support you because they're not a specialist in addiction. But you feel rejected, you come back, then your substance abuse gets even worse. And for example, say you're someone who's recently migrated from Punjab to Surrey, BC, you're already lonely as it is. And we always know that loneliness is actually a really, really tough experience to have. And so then you might develop an addiction, an alcohol addiction. So it's really interesting because I feel like there's so many things at play in our work, and I feel like our work only really scratches the surface to that. And this is only 4 years in. So for me, the work is only starting now. We've really just scratched the surface.
I had a question. I feel like a theme that keeps coming up is this disconnect between community services that Taraki is providing and then like structural problems. Yeah, that maybe you've talked about is it's this like yeah, like of course Taraki can provide peer support, it can do what it can do, but then you have to kind of signpost people to yeah, like government funded structures. And that can often either not be streamlined or you might get rejected. And there is this like limit to what peer support or mental health supports can do if you are like yeah, structurally struggling, like if your basic needs aren't met. So I wonder how Taraki addresses that or if like that's something you guys have been talking about. Yeah, like how that shows up in your work.
We're very honest about our work because we don't come, like I said, I'll always be honest. I don't come from a mental health background, right? So if you come to me with something that is out of my pay bracket or out of my scope, I will signpost you to the relevant person. At the same time, at Turkey, we know that we cannot make up for institutional neglect, institutional abuse, things like that. We know that the work that we do in peer support is really a very small part. It's like a small stone in the big pond. So I think honesty is quite important. And it does mean that you end up taking on more than you should or have the capacity for, because people going to mainstream services are not necessarily given the support that they, or the culturally safe and the culturally competent support that they deserve and need. So it's not necessarily to say it feels like you're fighting a battle that can't be won, but we're also realistic about what is possible. And that's always the contradiction, isn't it? Like, how much of it can you take on knowing that there are gaps in mainstream services on an institutional and structural level that shouldn't exist in the first place? And Chirinji says it the best. He says, in an ideal world, Taraki shouldn't exist. We want to work towards retirement. That's fundamentally what we're aiming for. We don't know if that's possible in me and Chirinji's lifetime, but that's what we're aiming for. Taraki should not exist. It really shouldn't. We're quite honest about why we exist. Of course, we exist because we have love for our communities, but we exist because people don't have anywhere else to go. And so we're trying to just work towards retirement, which I don't think is possible in the next 50 to 100 years. Either way, we're very honest, and I'm very honest about what my scope is and what Taraki's scope is. And if you need support outside of the scopes, I will signpost you to the relevant people, because really, when it comes to people safeguarding, I do not mess with that in any way.
I think kind of building on that, we talked about a little bit in the beginning that the South Asian community, the Punjabi community, it isn't a monolith. Like not from even in the same like diasporic space, like from one person to the next, it's not the same experience. And then you were sort of talking about this, a lot of resources don't have the sort of cultural humility that we want to like access, and people will often enter these spaces, ask for help, feel rejected, whether that's from like community or that's from structural spaces that provide help. They'll feel rejected. It'll kind of feed into this cycle of rejection, loneliness, problems with substance use or problems with alcohol. What sort of things, and this is I think the $1 million question that maybe you don't have an answer to, but what sort of things are you thinking about when you're like people who are developing resources and people who are developing structural support networks that might have the background of mental health, that might have the background of recovery, when they're developing resources for the Punjabi community, what are the things that they should think about based on the conversations that you're having in these like mental health spaces with men that are in the community?
I think the best thing I would say is get people with lived experience in your councils, in your advisory boards, because fundamentally, the people who will provide the best change are the people who've been through that, who've experienced a level of oppression, discrimination, whatever the case is, or just have had, it doesn't necessarily even have to be a negative experience. They've lived it. And the people who've lived it will have better answers for you than anyone really. And so for me, it's all about co-collaboration with the people from those communities. And I feel like that doesn't necessarily happen as much as it should. And that's why we're seeing mainstream services not being able to provide the support that Punjabi and South Asian communities need.
Yeah, for sure. And then one of the other questions that is sort of like in the same vein, we're sort of talking about people reaching out for help to family members, to friends. When people reach out for that help, how do you sort of think about when you're not trained, when you're just like someone who's in someone's care network in a way? What are the ways that you can have this conversation? What are ways that you can make it so that people don't feel this sort of rejected feeling where they're sort of like, I feel this shame and I can't access the support again because I don't feel like I got the sort of response I needed?
And that's a very tough question because fundamentally, and we see that quite a lot. So we're working with like localized networks to be able to deliver referral networks, right? So for example, Alcohol Anonymous, which is a charity in the UK, they have a referral network that works directly with the NHS. If someone Punjabi or South Asian comes through that, we have people who would effectively work to kind of integrate that person into AA, but from a South Asian or Punjabi perspective. And fundamentally, what we're seeing right now is that there is a big net, and South Asian and Punjabi folks keep falling through that net. So we're effectively trying to build referral networks so that we know that in the mainstream services there is a gap. But if we can create some pathways, those people hopefully end up in the right services. And at the same time, I feel like there has to be a drive in literacy, for example, in having conversations around addiction, which is such a big project, right? So if we take addiction, for example, how do you support someone who has addiction when there is like so much shame? Shalom is like immediately the concept, right? That's such a big thing. How do you support someone who has an addiction in your family? So I think there has to be a big literacy drive. And that's not to put the emphasis on the communities themselves, because, like I said, we need specialists from our communities delivering those services. But I think there has to be a level of like working with the communities to be able to provide their relevant support. And I think in most cases, support just means signposting. I'm really happy that we have so many more South Asian therapists. I've never seen so many in my life. And I always like to keep like a list handy, and we also have them in our program as well, based on the location that we're working or we are working in, so that we can signpost people accordingly. Because fundamentally, then what ends up happening is that if you don't have pathways and if you don't have signposting, take me for example, about 11 years ago in my early 20s, I had a depressive episode. I went to the NHS, I walked into A&E, I told her I was having these weird symptoms I couldn't explain. I just recently started a new job. Without asking me anything more, she prescribed me antidepressants. And I was like, whoa, like that's a big heavy slap you just gave me there. And she was like, please don't come to A&E ever again for something like this. And I was like, but I didn't know what to do. I go back home, I speak to my family, and I remember the attitude at the time was just like, but there's nothing wrong with you. Like, you've recently graduated university with the highest accolade, you've got a job straight away, like there's nothing wrong with you. But inside I was really struggling. And that shame took years to come over. Like to get over that, to feel like, yeah, to actually accept that I had a mental health episode. That took some time. And I was so lucky. I will always say I was so lucky that I was able to start attending Taraki spaces, because that's where I could actually be like, oh yeah, I went through this and this is what happened to me and here I am now. So it actually gave me an ability to kind of like have a coherent narrative. What ends up happening is if you go somewhere and either whether it's mainstream healthcare services or in your family or your community, and they're just like, there's nothing wrong with you, that rejection is so hard to take. And I think that does as much damage as to what you're feeling. I think it has like a compound effect. And so, yeah, I know that's a long-winded way to answer your question, but I feel like there has to be two things I think that needs to be really emphasized: cultural humility in mainstream services, and also a sense of like mental health literacy uptake in our own communities, so that we can support the people. And I'm not saying everyone needs to be a therapist, not that in any way, but just having the right language and the right signposting.
Thank you for sharing your own story. And I like the fact that you're like, you need to create space for people to be able to share that with you without invalidating their experiences or like sort of shutting it down, because then people are like more reluctant to reach out for help anyway, but also finding more equipped people to direct friends and family to so that they can get the help that they need in a more effective way. This might be a slightly hard pivot, but I want to go back to stuff that you were kind of talking about in the beginning about the sort of gender dynamics that you explore within your curriculum and how caregiving is coming up in that curriculum. And I think this is one of the things that we have been talking about a lot just with your curriculum. It's a lot about men's mental health and like thinking about their like peer support networks and creating those in a more structured way for people. And we want to know sort of how do those gender dynamics come up and how do those conversations look within your like organization and within that curriculum and within the larger community when you have these conversations.
So fundamentally, this is how I see it because I've done it myself. Men end up relying on women very much in an emotional context, especially if in a relationship with your partner, for your sense of, for everything. They end up becoming your therapist. Let's be honest. Um, and a lot of men do that, and it's harmful. I mean, it's harmful to everyone. It's harmful to the women in your life because they end up taking more of an emotional toll than they should. It's harmful to you because you don't build the skills that you necessarily need to be able to self-regulate, to be able to self-soothe, to be able to co-regulate with other people. And I know I'm speaking very much like therapized language because I have spent a lot of time in therapy. In terms of conversations in the group itself, and this is my personal opinion, is that I'm effectively, the way I see the program is that it gives the men two things. It gives them the ability to self-regulate, and it gives them the ability to co-regulate. So that might sound very like therapeutic language, so I'll try to break it down in a way that is very laddie to everyday guy. So self-regulate is the ability to be able to regulate your own emotions without needing as much external reliance, right? So like, um, and that is very, very fundamentally important because what ends up happening for a lot of men is that they end up relying on women in their lives to be able to regulate their own emotions. And so for me, that is incredibly important. And that's why module one is called personal motivations, because fundamentally what we're doing is we're trying to build the emotional toolkit and resources for the men so that they are able to learn regulation themselves. Then module two is more about co-regulation because fundamentally as a facilitator, that's what you will be doing. You'll be co-regulating the men who come into your spaces. So we always try to like have that within the program itself, and that's how I try to view the work itself. Because quite a few of the men, including me when I started, and even now, there is always that natural view to kind of like go and dump your emotional load on the women around you. And that comes up quite a bit in the program. And what is very cute is that the men start off the program being like, oh, like they don't necessarily know what to expect. They might think they really don't. They might think it's a bit woo or things like that. But by the end, they're like, I'm so happy that I have like other men that I can just talk to because fundamentally that's what I need. And so what we're trying to do is really have an upskilling element so that the men who attend the programs are able to self-regulate and co-regulate. So that ultimately what it does is it alleviates the emotional stress on the women in our lives. And so that fundamentally we have better communities so that everyone is able to live to their full potential. That's really how I see it. If you feel good and regulated within yourselves and you feel like you have the life skills to progress, great. And I want that for everyone in your family and your communities. And I've really, for me, that is a very important part because fundamentally the work that we're doing is we're trying, and we never really say this publicly until now, I guess, is that this is our effort to kind of combat gender-based violence, right? Because men who are not fulfilled, men who are lonely, fundamentally that is a ripple effect that will reach out into the communities. And who are the first to suffer? Women. Whether it's women in their families, their intimate partners, their friends. Oh, why the women? Just like in society. And so fundamentally what we're trying to do is hopefully support the men so that they can feel better in themselves. They're able to have better emotional literacy, better skills and tools, and a sense of community so that they're able to live better, fuller lives. Srinji describes it the best. He says, think of our work as like gardening, right? Imagine like we're looking after flowers, but there is a sheet of like, there's a cover on the flowers. And so our work is removing that sheet so that the flowers can grow fully. And that's fundamentally how we see the men that we engage with. We want these men to live full, open, honest, fulfilling lives. And that for me is important because everyone should have the right to do that, but not just men, everyone in our communities. And I think men play a central role in that because let's be honest, we are the biggest purveyors of violence as well. So it really is preventative care. And I feel like we could start even earlier working with young boys and something I would like to go down and work with later. But that's really how I see it because yeah, women end up taking the toll in every sense. Now, whether it's emotional toll from the partner who doesn't have friends to go and like have just like a co-regulate with. If it's not that, then it's a woman experiencing violence because a man isn't regulated in himself and doesn't know how to process his emotions, and anger is the first thing that comes to him. So it really is about preventative care.
I'm curious, I guess, on two fronts. How have conversations, because you've been doing this for a while, but how have conversations about traditional gender roles or just gender roles broadly, how have they changed since you started this work to now, if they've changed at all? And similarly, has the way that substance use or addiction come up, has that changed as well? Yeah, those are two things I'm curious about what those conversations look like.
So in terms of like gender roles or addressing gender in the spaces, it has become more honest. It has also become like more vocal. And I don't necessarily mean that in a like incel alt-right kind of way. I just mean there's been a greater sense of accountability that we've seen. But at the same time, you have to understand that the men we work with, it's between 35 to 55. So these are men who have either been in established relationships or have had gone through separation. Basically, they've walked a few hard miles to be honest enough with themselves. And so when it comes to talking about gender and women in their lives, there is an open and honesty to acknowledge that, yeah, I messed this up. I messed that up because I couldn't necessarily explore my emotions, or I didn't have the vocabulary to speak my emotions or be able to communicate in an appropriate way and things like that. So there has been a accountability element which I really, really appreciate because you see a lot of like performative things online by younger guys, whereas it's it's welcoming to see older South Asian men, and I say older, I'm 34 myself, being more honest about the mistakes that we have made, whether it's through conditioning or individual choice. Either way, I can appreciate that honesty. And so there has been a good accountability shift that I've seen within the work. Of course, it might be different if we were working with like young 20-year-olds, because I think they probably have gone more alt-right incel overall. Um, but in specific to the work that we've been, but it's a context-based thing, right? We work with older men, so there is a more of honest accountability that's there. In terms of substance abuse, again, that isn't a conversation that happens more openly. One, men are more willing to openly acknowledge that they have a substance abuse issue or challenge, but there's also greater criticism of community, and especially community sites where you expect to be provided support. Um, so, for example, like religious sites, right, like the masjid or the gurdwara, you have people more openly speaking about the fact that they went to those sites to seek support and were rejected or were not given the necessary right support. And I know that's very, very hard to take, but at the same time, as someone who works in the sector, unless they've been given like mental health literacy on how to support addiction, fundamentally, it's not their role to support you like that. I think they can provide peer support, but I don't think they would be the ones, doing like a 12-week plan with you on how to support you and things like that. Either way, there is more openness, there is more honesty, but also there's more accountability. And I can really appreciate that as just someone of my generation, because my dad is never someone who took accountability for how he was when we were younger or how he behaved. So just on a personal level, to see older South Asian men being like, yeah, you know what, like I could be a better partner to my wife. Like, oh, okay, yeah, it's actually, I'm happy to hear that, and I'm happy that the tools that you explore in the program hopefully give you that to be able to act on it as well.
I really liked sort of the way you framed your work as preventative care and like how working in this sort of space allows you to do preventative care for intimate partner violence or gender-based violence and creating these like support networks and ways for men to be able to regulate their emotions has a sort of direct correlation in your mind, even if that's not outwardly what you're saying. It, as a long-term vision, this is something that you think about. And when you were talking about sort of these are older men who maybe have gone on this journey and been like, actually, I need help. I messed up in some way. They've like sort of gone through different channels and come to you or come to this sort of space and been like, let's have this conversation now and I'm ready to have this conversation. You'd mentioned that something you'd like to do in life generally is work with young men, young boys, adolescent boys, whoever it may be, to think about the ways that you can create peer support networks for them and prevent that loneliness sort of catching up to them also. And again, this is not something that you do. Obviously, it's something that you might be thinking about in the future. What do you think is important to bring these young men in and bring these young boys in to do this preventative care with them before they kind of experience those 15 years of life where they're like, damn, I messed up and now I need help?
Just a quick one on the humility part. We ran a cohort, or we did the program in Leicester, and there are two men in their 50s. We started the session, and he was like, "Oh, hey, nice to see you again." And they were joking because they probably just, not probably, they saw each other the same day. And I was like, "Oh, so you met outside of the program?" And they were like, "Yeah. So he has a friend who was feeling lonely and is going through a mental health struggle. So we all just met up in the park and played football." And I was like, "Cool. Like, imagine men in their 50s being like, okay, that man feels lonely. We're gonna go to the park with him and play football." And like I thought it was so like wholesome and loving. And that kind of humility, I think, is something that really does come with age. So I'm quite lucky in that I work with men who've walked a few hard miles to know that life will humble you one way or another. Specific to younger people, that's a really good and important question, and it is an area that we need to go into. And I'll be honest with you, I honestly don't know what that would look like. As much as I have a belief that we should be there and we should be doing the good work, one, I'm not necessarily someone who's young anymore. I'm like 34. I'm young in the grand scheme of life, but I'm not like 20s young. And so I honestly don't know what that approach would look like. I really do think for me it comes down to generational ties. Fundamentally, I think, and this is where I'm so lucky, I had very active uncles in my life. Like, they were more active than my dad. Like, one of my uncles was like my dad. The other uncle was also like my dad. So I had like multiple dads making up for my own dad. Either way, a lot of the literacy around masculinity came through them. And I feel like what's currently happening is that because that sense of connection is fundamentally broken, you can blame social media, technology, um, lack of access to community centers and things like that. The young guys end up then looking to influences in the wrong places, like Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson. And because they're so easily accessible and they sit on YouTube for 4 hours, it's not hard to miss a man talking for 4 hours. That's not to say that the generations before, like my uncle did say a very toxic thing, but it was in the home. Now you've got this universalized way of packaging nonsense in a way that is very accessible for young men. And so I think it's very, very important to kind of like fill up that space that the young men are actively looking for, where they need guidance and they need support for the challenges they face. And so they have a better way forward. And I think that really comes down to community ties and generational ties. Because fundamentally, a lot of the young men that I see online and we come across within our work need guidance. And not guidance in the sense that like to pave the way for them, but just more to have the space where they can have these conversations about, I spend 5 hours doom scrolling and that gives me anxiety, but I don't know who to tell. I think even for us might seem like not necessarily trivial, but for all generations, like if I said that to my dad, he was just like, just go for a walk. But recognizing that it's an important thing that they feel and then providing guidance and space for that. So for me, to answer your question, I think we need space where you have generational ties.
I'm wondering, um, I guess this sounds like maybe one of the challenges that Taraki is coming up against, but I'm wondering like what have been some of the challenges in the peer support groups and also more broadly in Taraki.
In terms of the challenges itself, so we now have a decentralized approach, right? So at Turkey, we don't necessarily believe in centralized power. So if someone comes to us being like, hey, do you do peer support in somewhere like Washington, D.C., we won't be the ones who'll deliver it. We'll give you the tools. We'll come and do the program. And so a big challenge is effectively trying to build capacity in other organizations so that they can take the work forward. And that's been a big challenge in the sense that there's a lack of funding, and also a lot of the people who want to do this work are not necessarily from the third sector, so they might not know how to like go up the charity ladder, how to find funding, how to build a team, how to do all those things. So a big challenge for us is really external in the sense that we're trying to build a movement, but it requires also working with partners who are not as big as Turkey, because Turkey has become quite big over time. And so that's one challenge. People always say, oh, well, men don't talk enough, but that has never been the challenge because the men don't stop talking. So that's not necessarily a challenge in itself, but capacity building has been a challenge. There has been a rise in toxic content, masculinity online, and now it's becoming braver and braver. We've seen a wider geopolitical flow to the right, extreme right. And so there is a big swing about getting masculinity back. And so the challenge has been navigating that political and social shift while staying true to our word. But we were never someone who took a political approach. We always took an approach like, we are community orientated and we are here for you. But even those ideas are now starting to be questioned in mainstream narratives. And so for being soft or being like woke and things like that. So to be honest, another big challenge is that as the political landscape changes, there's also like a cut in funding and things like that. So that's another thing we have to be aware of on like a bigger level. So there isn't challenges more in terms of the work and delivery, because that's beautiful and the men come and we have a chat and there's positive, meaningful change. It's more like the big structural things happening around us that we really have to stay on top of. And a lot of those things we can't stay top of. We can't stop like the shift towards right-wing governments. So yeah, it's about knowing the landscape and trying to work with it as best as we can.
That's really interesting to sort of think about in here. I think you really created a very cool thorough line through all the different conversations you've had and that your experience with creating these networks, developing these peer support systems. And it's interesting to see sort of how loneliness, masculinity, migration, substance use, gender roles, and violence all interact with each other and are circular in a way. And it's not just these small little like problems that we have in our community that we're not thinking about as a connected space, but how your experience in these like peer support networks and building these has actually shown you that everything is sort of connected and doing your work is this preventative care against a lot of these things. I think to bring that conversation together, we'd love to know you started this conversation out by saying that you came into this work after dealing with some stuff yourself and interacting with this space and then becoming a provider almost in this space. How has your experience informed the ways that you give care? And then is there anything that you found challenging self-identifying as Punjabi, maybe a little bit younger than like the people that you're working with and serving people that are sort of going through crises that maybe you've gone through or thought about in the past?
Yeah, it's for me, it's been such an interesting journey. The way that my own lived experience has shaped my work, and it's something that's ongoing, is that as there is my own reconciliation of my own life, I think those themes then become kind of like get interwoven into the work itself. So me recognizing that historically I've relied more on women as my therapist, then makes me realize the importance of embedding things into the curriculum, where it's being like, no, men need to support other men. It can't be the women that do it all the time. And I'm so like intimately tied to this work itself. And so a lot of my experiences, I've literally grown with the work. Like a really good story, for example, is that when the first ever time we ran this program, we ran it in Leeds, up in Yorkshire. And the men there are like very traditionally masculine. And so like me and Sharanjit rock up. He's wearing his shorts. He's always in shorts, no matter what the season. I'm also in shorts, and I typically wear like a big golden earring. And we look like a bunch of city boys, just like in the middle of nowhere, in like near like tough estates. Even though I grew up in an estate, just the way I present myself is different. Either way, there was a person in the program who was like very traditionally masculine, and he used to work in a boys' correctional school. And before the session, we'd be like, "Oh, what are you doing?" He was like, "I was punching the bag, like just punching the bag in his garden because it's been a tough day." And you know what? Because I was the only non-Sikh person delivering and in the room, he would never call me Paji. Like he would like Shrinj Paji, blah blah blah. And I remember by the end of the program, he was like Taimour Paji, and I was like, I guess I've got somewhere with him. And he really we developed a sense of like commonality and things like that. And so the reason I bring up that anecdote or that story is because, like I said, I'm so intimately tied to my work. So, for example, we ran this curriculum in Melbourne, Australia, place we've never been to. The toilets flush the other way from what I saw in The Simpsons, not this way, it goes the other way. And we ran it with South Asian men, not Punjabi men. So we had people of like Tamil descent, we had like really all the people from South Asian communities. And I remember, had I not gone through that experience of like, I am Punjabi, but someone who is also Punjabi didn't necessarily see me as like one of his own because I wasn't Punjabi Sikh. So when we did the program in Melbourne, Australia, I wanted everyone to know that what unites us is more than what divides us. And so to answer your question, like how is my own personal experience shaped, is because I've been through so much with the program. I kind of have like I'm like an early warning signal of what a person might feel like coming to the space based on who they are, where they come from, their migrant status, their class, all the different things that make us who we are. And so I'm basically like a radar that's always thinking of how can I make you feel safe and comfortable in this space, but in a way that you don't feel like it's hurting your masculinity. If that makes sense, because all men have a masculinity that can get touched beyond a certain point where you feel like you're being coddled. And so I'm always like, I always say this to the students that are part of the program. I'm like, I'm exhausted after the session because I'm monitoring all of your faces all the time and the emotions and the tone of your voice. Because I know what it's like not to feel welcomed, or I know what it's like for someone to not feel welcome, and things like that. So I really use as much of my personal experiences to shape what someone feels like in the space itself. And it is exhausting. So, going back to your question about gender dynamics and caregiving, I think this gives like me, but also the men, the effort it takes to be a caregiver and how exhausting it can be, but how you need to show up and do it for yourself and your communities. And if you say it, you got to act on it. And so it's really is a it's a speed course on how to be caregiving for people in your communities. And if you want change for your communities, you have to be the one doing it, not the women in your communities all the time.
No, yeah, this has been a great conversation. I feel like as we were chatting, I was like, we'll have to do a follow-up, a part two. But yeah, I'm wondering, Taimour, is there anything that you want to add, anything that we weren't able to chat about, something that, like a lingering thought that you had before we wrap it up?
There is a poem that Muhammad Ali said, which I need to check up on it, but well, there's two things, right? So Muhammad Ali once said at a university conference, "Me, we," which is apparently the shortest poem ever recorded. So effectively, he was saying the importance that me, we, like we are all part of communities. And another big thing, a lot of my politicization and the work that we do is based in political thought. Ella Baker, who is the incredible organizer in the civil rights movement, she always believed that it's about giving people the light so that they can find their own way. That's why at Turkey, and this is my own, also my personal belief, is that we give people the support and the tools that they need, and then they take the work forward. We're not the ones who will come in and be arrogant enough to know what it means to be Punjabi in Vancouver, in Melbourne, blah, 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 things like that. So the last thing I just want to say is that we all exist within community, and community is so important. And while I never want to have children, I want to make sure that future generations have the best access to things and they have beautiful communities to flourish in. And that's really all I want. And hopefully we're doing that, Turkey.
That was a beautiful way to, I think, wrap up this conversation. I really appreciated sort of the way that you bring such empathy from your own lived experience into these spaces. And I think that the various communities that you work with are very lucky to have a person who has such lived experiences, but is there to bring other people into the fold and care for them and create these networks. I think people learning from your lived experience and people learning from this curriculum will be very important for us building communities that are really deeply centered within care. Thank you so much for being on this podcast, talking to us, taking an hour out of your Saturday. I really enjoyed this conversation. I've learned so much.
Thank you for joining Sath, the Asra podcast. If you have enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe or follow our social media at asra.now so you never miss an episode.
We would love to know what you think about today's episode. Please leave us a comment or send us a direct message. If you have any suggestions for future podcast guests, please fill out the Google form on our website or in the episode description. If you'd like additional information or resources in Punjabi or in English, please visit the ASRA website at www.asranow.ca. Thank you.